Hello, Patreons. Welcome to my review of the brush and pencil color pencil painting kit. This is my first go at using it, and I'm pretty excited at how well it works. I absolutely love it. I'm working on Uart 500 sanded paper at the moment, and this is the first time I've also used sanded paper with color pencil, and wow, it's very different to the watercolor paper I usually work on. So it was quite a learning curve for both products. But pretty excited with how it went. And my aim for this piece is not to make the prettiest piece, but to really test out the products and see how they go and if they can do the things that everyone seems to say that they can, which I'm impressed to say they do. They are amazing. So to start off with, just lightly putting in some background colors. I've got a reference photo I'm working from, but I'm not really following it very closely. And it's a reference photo I took. With the pencils, you do press lightly. I found that I kept pressing too hard, and I was burning through my pencils quite a lot. So just a very light touch. You can have the pencil on the side and just sort of skim it across the surface, leaving hardly any pencil. Like, you won't burn through the pencil nearly as fast as what I did in this piece, because I was just pressing way too hard. The sand on the paper just sort of scrapes the pigment off so easily, so you don't need to press hard at all. So there I blended it out using the applicator that came with the kit, and just with a bit of the powder blender on it, and just sort of smoothing that all out and seeing how my first blending goes. And then I sprayed it with the texture fixative and let that dry for 15 odd minutes before coming back over with more layers. So here I'm going over with some more blues, darkening up and deepening those colors, and also bringing in some dark reds, and just using those colors, because you can still see the color that is behind it. It blends so smoothly out. It's a really nice effect and makes blurry backgrounds really simple to do. I did find that the applicator was a little bit annoying to use for the background. It's too small and fiddly. I've since gotten my hands on some of the soft pan pastel blending tools, the sponges that come on a nice little handle. They kind of look like palette knives, but with a sponge on the end. And they work so much better for the backgrounds. Not so good for in smaller detailed areas, but for the background, it makes it so much smoother, and you don't get that sort of circly effect I'm getting as I'm blending this background. It makes it a lot smoother. And it's also good when you're trying to do straight horizon type lines, so it just smooths it all out. You can just go straight across with those, because they're a much larger sort of face that you're using, whereas this one, I'm just using a little tiny edge of the applicator. So there I blended it all out, and then I've sprayed it with the fixative again. So pretty much if you see me using the applicator directly after that, or once I've done a full section of the artwork, I'll spray with the fixative before going over that area again. Now just further deepening the colour and still pressing way too hard. I found I was getting a lot of dust coming off, and that is because I was pressing too hard with the pencils. But it didn't really matter too much. But yeah, just burnt through the pencils more than I needed to have done. Also, when blending with those applicators or with any sponge, be aware that if you blend a dark area and you use that same sponge in a light area, it will have that pigment and drop that pigment in other areas. So you can use it to your advantage. Sometimes put a bit of colour in an area that you haven't used the pencil to add it to. But if you do have an area where it's light, and you don't want that colour in, change to a different applicator, or I found wiping it onto paper towel helped a bit as well to remove some of the pigment off of it before using it on that area. If it's a white area, I'd probably use a new applicator just to keep it clean. I would also definitely invest in more applicators than what came with the kit, because I went through those pretty quick and haven't worked out exactly how I'm supposed to clean them yet. I'll figure it out though. I tried washing them in water and it removes some of the pigment but not heaps. I found blotting it on paper towel did the best to remove the pigment so that they could be reused. I don't like throwing things out, so I'm one of those people who try to reuse everything. Don't like wasting stuff, so if I can figure out how to reuse them, I will. I'm just further building up those colours in the background. And I love how easy it was to get that soft, blurry look. Now for this part, I'm coming over with the titanium white powder just directly, and I've dipped the applicator into it and I'm just sort of smudging it onto the page and seeing how it goes. I wasn't a huge fan of this application. It got those little circles, but they weren't nice, clean circles like you'd get in some backgrounds where you go for that circular look. It didn't quite do that. Potentially, if I'd use like a stencil and press it against that, a circular stencil, that might get that effect a bit better. But for now, I was just sort of seeing how it went and sort of adding in white to lighten up some of the areas. And see how easy it is to actually lighten it up though. This is not something you would have been able to do normally without this titanium white powder. It just goes on top so easily and so nicely. I will have to figure out a better way of applying that. I think maybe mixing it with the powder blender, it might make it move around a little bit better. I've seen someone do that, so I'll have to test that out and see if that helps with applying it onto the paper. And potentially a different tool would have made it apply a bit better as well. The applicator, it would put that deposit of the white in that spot where it first hits, and it was just a little bit too much all at that first spot where you press. So I will have to figure out a better way of putting that on. But like, see how well it just lightened that whole area up and made that the background have that nice white hazy look rather than the vibrant colour that was there before. Now just going over the top of the white with some colour pencil and just taking that white off of some of that so it's not quite as stark. I just want to soften it a little bit. And colour pencil goes over the top of that really easily. I'm adding lots of different colours into this background. I'm just seeing how it goes. I liked how well the yellow went over the titanium white and how well that stood out. At this point, the background looks nothing like my reference photo. But that's all good because I wasn't trying to replicate it identically. I just wanted to see what would happen when I tried with different colours and mix it all together. So now I'm blending that out a little bit. Just smoothing the colour pencil that I just put on top of the white, just smoothing it down a bit. And see how much that softened those white dots, because they were a little bit too harsh before. Now I tried with a paintbrush there for a moment and did not work. And then with a bit of a sponge, I was like, oh, I'll see what that does. And no, it did not work. So back to the applicator. Here I'm trying a bit more of the titanium white and just whitening up a few of those areas. trying to figure out a way to apply it without getting that initial splotch in the center. Might be that I need to actually have the applicator a bit more on its side rather than the tip. It could be as simple as that, as to why it keeps doing that sort of white splotch in the middle. But as you can see, I think here I've mixed the titanium white with the powder blender now, so which is making it move around a little bit more and not get quite so stuck to the paper in that initial press, the initial point of contact. Now just adding some more color into the background. And I found with the texture fixative, you could just keep adding more and more. In a few areas, I did find that it got harder and harder to add color, even with the texture fixative. But I think I may potentially have some issues with the paper I've got at the moment. I heard that some people got a bad batch, and I think I may be one of those. It's just that in some areas I found, not so much in this piece, but in the next one that I've been working on since making this piece, that the pencil seemed to stick to the sand on the paper, and the powder blender wouldn't move it around. It would just stick to it, and I couldn't quite work out how to cover that up, and so it got quite a grainy look, and nothing was working, like the pencil wouldn't stick to it. So I think that may potentially be from my paper. I'm not entirely sure if it is an issue with my application of it, if I've made a mistake somewhere along the way. So I will have to try and work that out. But yeah, that's the only issue I've come across so far, and that potentially may be from the paper itself, not from the kit. See how easy it is to add shadows in onto that stem. As it adds some color, smooth it all out, and make it a nice smooth shadow rather than having to try and change the number of layers that you put on. The powder blender just smooths it all out. It's amazing stuff, this. And then just being able to come back with an eraser and clean that up. And the eraser will take it back to your last layer of fixative. So unlike when you're using odorless solvent, where on watercolor paper, I've never found erasers to be that useful. They didn't really take the pencil back too far. But on the sanded paper, it does lift up the pencil back until the last layer of fixative. So you can lift it off quite well. I think you're supposed to use a kneaded eraser, not the electric one that I've used, because I'm not sure if that would potentially damage the sand paper or if it's just going to burn through the eraser too quickly. But I did test it out with a kneaded eraser, and the kneaded eraser works really well as well. Just lifts the colored pencil right off the paper. And just adding little highlights in and building up those colors in the stem. And this is my first go at trying to do any sort of detail work on the sanded paper, and I found the sanded paper's got quite a grainy look to it, and I found it hard to try and overcome that. I'm not used to it. It's fine when you step back from the page, but when you're looking at it close, you can see the graininess of the sand, and that is pretty much my biggest beef with it. I can't seem to overcome that. But the thing is, you only notice it when you've got your nose right up against a piece of paper, like when you're working on it and you're looking at it really closely, then you notice that graininess. But if you're standing back, you don't see it at all. So I think I just have to get over that a bit, because the effects you can make with the paper are amazing, and I think that outweighs that sort of slight graininess. It's only the faintest slight bit of graininess. It's not very obvious at all, but my OCD is telling me it's too grainy. So I've started adding in some detail onto these flowers and just seeing how it goes for blending it out. I do find it a little bit hard to blend out the detail without it just smudging it everywhere. Not sure if that's just my use of the applicator. It's because it doesn't have a fine point. So I'm going to see if I can get a tool which has a finer point, which would work better for blending. And then just adding in some shadows and using different browns on the flower petals and the stems. At this point, I'm still going with yellow flowers. You'll see shortly, they do not stay yellow. But at this point, I thought I was drawing yellow flowers. That's what my reference photo had, was yellow flowers. So that's what I'm doing. I love how, as you'll see in this video, I just randomly decided I wanted to change it completely, and you can do that. This, the texture fixative and the powder blender, that allows you to just change things completely, and it's awesome. You don't have to be as stuck on getting it completely planned out at the beginning. It's still a good idea to know what you're doing, but you've got the ability to change things. If something is not working in a certain spot, you can actually move it. It takes a little bit of extra work, but with the fixative, you can just move it over. Like if you want to move a flower or, remove it altogether, you can do that. I found with my cream pencil that it did tend to stick to the sand on the paper a bit more than my other pencils. I'm not sure why this is. It was a bit more resistant to blending with the powder blender as well, so I'm not sure if my particular pencil has a bit of a higher wax content in it, because that's how the higher content wax pencils work, like the luminance pencils. They don't blend as easily. I'm not sure if that's what's going on, if my particular pencil happens to have more wax in it than it should, or if that color just happens to be like that. But it does seem to have more of an issue with blending than my other color pencils did. So I'm not sure why, but if you're finding that, that's the case. That's what I've found anyway. Be curious to know if anyone else has that same issue, or if it's just my particular pencil. I'm just building up those layers in the stem and underneath the flower, and trying to add in a bit more detail. I love how you can use the powder blender to just soften off the coloured lines that you put in. I did find it a little bit harder to get the details in than I do on watercolour paper. That might just be more that I just need a little bit more practice at it, because it does feel like a completely different medium, and I do still need to practice to get to where I want with my artwork with this kit. And that's just, the more I do it, the more experience with how the different things go together and how they affect each other. And the more practice I get, the better I'll get at it. So, well, I am pretty impressed with my first go at it. Like, this piece, definitely when you see it at the end, it's nothing like how it was when I started. It changed so completely. And just like then, I moved the stem of that flower because it wasn't looking quite right. So I moved it over a bit. Still not quite looking right. So, I'm just adding in a flower on top, seeing how that goes. And then I decide to add in some other flowers, because I'd heard that, you could just add things in like that. And I was like, nah, that's not impossible. You can't do that with colour pencils. So why don't I give it a go? So I've sketched them in, now getting in just a base layer of colour. And then once I've got the colour in on all of the new flowers, I'll spray it with the fixative so I can go over it with more layers. I was just curious at this point to see what would happen. And I wasn't sure if I'd ruined it at this point because I was like, I don't know, I assume this is going to work. Just adding in colours all over the place. Blending it out and seeing how it blends on top of the other layers. Something I will mention is you do get it all over your hand when you're leaning on the sanded paper, which is what I tend to do, but it's something I'm probably going to have to stop because it does go all over your hand and you end up smearing it everywhere. So keep that in mind. Now just going over the next layer, using the cream to build up those flower petals and make that colour a bit more opaque. And just add in a few extra petals. See how easy I added in extra petals? It's like, oh look, more petals! And then, you know, clean it up with an eraser. Oh, didn't want that one there. That one didn't look as good as I thought it would, so I'll just erase it. Can't do that with a watercolour paper. I also decided that I didn't like this flower at all. It didn't look like it was pointing in the right direction, even though that's what it looked like in the reference photo. So I was just like, okay, I'm just going to remove it. So here, you'll notice that the cream pencil that I have used is difficult to cover. And that's because it was sticking to the sand on the paper more so than the other pencils. So it didn't blend very well. Granted, I've already sprayed it with fixative, but it didn't cover very well either, which is unusual. The other areas covered really well. Like, see how there's a difference in that coloured pencil where it goes over the background to over the flower? It's a lot duller on where the flower was, and that's to do with this issue that I'm finding. And it may be because I pressed too hard with that pencil, or there's just something in that cream that's different to other coloured pencils. I'm not sure, but it definitely behaves differently when you're trying to cover it, and it shouldn't. It should just cover that evenly. So I'm just keep on adding more layers and blending it out and just seeing what happens. And at this point I'm going to do a layer of fixative, but I figured I'd work on the other flowers before doing the fixative. With the fixative, I tend to take it outside to spray. Other people say that they are okay spraying it inside, but as I have kids in the house, I figured it's just safer to spray it all outside. It doesn't take very long to step outside the door and spray it. And then you make sure to let it dry thoroughly for at least 15 minutes, 10-15 minutes. Also with the texture fixative, if you're finding that it's fluttering too much, you may need to clean the nozzle. You can just do that by putting it into a cup of hot water, soaking it for a minute. I find if I take a tissue and just get the drop that sort of sticks to the outside of the nozzle after you've sprayed, and use the tissue to just clean that off, that helps stop that from happening as well. I'm just adding more layers in. And at this point, my flowers are still yellow. As you'll see as I go along, I decide that I like I'd like to have some white flowers instead of the yellow ones. So I end up changing the color of the flowers completely. And with any other, when using color pencils on watercolor paper with solvents, something you can't do. You can't make white flowers after you've already made them a different color. So I was pretty amazed at how well the flowers came up when I decided to change the color. And it's quite interesting seeing how well that the white pencil went down on the sanded paper. It's quite a different experience. It's a lot more opaque than it is on watercolor paper. And I'm quite excited to see what pieces I can do with this, because it's a different approach to drawing that you can just, take that white and go over the top and you can still see it really well. I'm quite excited by it. As you can see, now going over the background with blacks, and I decided that instead of having just sort of a splotchy background, I wanted to have a starry background with a bit of a galaxy. So I've started building up the dark colours and going over the top and blending it out, and just seeing how it goes at that sort of change. I definitely advise getting the soft tools to blend out, then using those little applicators, especially for the background areas. It makes it so much smoother for blending the larger soft tools. They're used for pastels. Building up the black at the top part now, and adding some purple in and building up those layers. And as you can see, you can still see the color from the background behind, and I'm using that color to make the starry sky look quite interesting and not just a flat black. I want it sort of to have a bit of a galaxy type look to it. Just blending it out. I'm not being very careful around the edges of the petals either when I blended that. As you can see, I kind of smudged the black over the top of the petals. Not an issue, because you can just fix that up when you're working on the flowers. Usually you'd be really careful along the edge to make sure you didn't overlap with your background, but no, if you just go right over the top, it didn't matter, and I just tidied them up later. More layers, and keep in mind that I am spraying with the texture fixative in between areas. So after I blended that, I would have taken it outside, sprayed it, and then now I'm back putting the next layer on top. If you don't spray it in between layers, you tend to knock off too much of the pigment off the paper. And when blending with the powder blender, I'm just dabbing the applicator in it just a tiny bit. You don't need too much, it goes a long way. I'm still working out how much you need as I'm going through learning this as a medium. It's a whole different way of drawing, so I definitely feel like I'm learning how to do it. Not an expert at it yet. But yeah, I'm still working out exactly how much powder that you need on the applicator. Sometimes I've used too much, and then other times, well, I don't think I've ever used not enough. So I think you don't need very much at all, I don't think. Just darkening that up. And with the if you want a dark area, don't try and go completely dark all at once. It's much better to build up the layers. So do a layer of black, then spray it with a fixative, then go over with another layer of black, and you'll get that dark look that you want eventually. After quite a few layers, you just build it up. Now here I'm taking the titanium white and I'm just sort of brushing on over the top of my stencil and just getting a splotchy pattern to make the galaxy look. And for this, I'm just seeing what happens when I do this. I'm not entirely sure what I'm doing. I'm just sort of having a bit of fun and seeing how this look goes and how it'll end up. I just thought, hey, what would happen if I used a stencil for that, for the titanium white, and how it would look over the top. I thought it was quite an interesting effect, and you could use that for different textures as well, like stone and everything. It could make quite an interesting texture using stencils like that with the titanium white. Here I'm just going over the white, and so making it not quite as bright, dulling it down a bit with my different colours. As you can see, the colour is not quite as opaque as the white was. Still a lot more opaque than what it would have been on watercolour paper though. Especially that green wouldn't have come up hardly at all on top of black on the watercolour paper. But you can still see it quite well. Now just blending it out. And that toned down that pattern I did quite a lot using the stencil. I was quite interested to see how that effect of the layers on top of that and how it changed the pattern that I've made with the stencil. I was having lots of fun just trying different things out and testing it in this piece. As you can see that spot where that flower was that I removed, you can't even tell that there was a flower there anymore. It's all covered up now. And here I've got the titanium white mixed with the touch-up texture, and I'm just using a spoon to flick it off of a paintbrush. Yeah, I switched brushes to one which had stiffer bristles, which worked a bit better. And just using that to flick the white all over the place to make sort of stars, and then using the brush to add in a few extra ones. And where I'm using my finger, I'm sort of dabbing it so that it smudges it out a bit. So if it was a bit that was a bit too bright, then my finger smudged it a bit. And that was a few too many that were bright there, so I'm just darkening them a little bit, making them look a bit further back. Now onto the flowers. So this is when I decided that, oh, I actually wanted white flowers, not yellow ones. So I thought I'd just see how we'd go at making them white. And I was quite impressed with how well the white went over the top of the yellow. And that yellow is quite dark. It's got a lot of brown in it. So it's not like it's going over a light colour. It's going over quite a dark colour there. And that colour I'm actually using at the moment, I think that might be ivory, not white. And just getting that layer in and then adding a bit more colour in, and then I'll spray with the texture fixative before going over it again to get that a bit more opaque. I'm just adding a little bit of pink in on the petals. Now I've done some purple shadows. I'm just building up those different colours in the white, because white's never really always just white. It's always got other colours in the shadows. Now, with this, I do find that you get a lot of it onto your hand if you're leaning on the paper like this. So I would advise either using like glassine paper to lean on, or making it's got 2 wooden blocks and a piece of cardboard stuck to it so that it's a spot where I can rest my hand, which is just above the paper. So I've been working making that, and that should help with that issue, because you do smudge it a lot on your hand, and while it's not an issue, it just makes the area a bit more messy, and you got to wash your hands and stuff afterwards because it's all over your hand. So I would advise not to lean your hand on the paper on the drawing because of how much that smudges. As you can see on the side of my board, it's all smudged over there from off of my hand. And just building up those layers some more, getting a bit more detail into the leaves. Oh, them. They're not really leaves. You see how well the white goes on top of all that colour. I'm definitely impressed with how opaque that Polychromos white is. Is one of those colours that on watercolour paper, it's not as opaque. There's times when I can use it in fur and things like that, but it's nowhere near as opaque as the Luminance white. But it works wonderfully on the sanded paper. Just building up those layers a bit more. And with the sanded paper, you don't have to press very hard at all. You can get a lot of colour down without pressing hard, especially in the initial layers. You don't put much pressure on the paper at all. Otherwise, you get too much pigment on the paper and it just ends up coming off as dust. So it's much better to press very lightly. Especially in the initial layers, you barely have to touch the paper with your pencil at all. The sanded paper sort of rubs the pigment off the pencil really easily. If you press too hard, you burn through the pencils a lot quicker, which I discovered with this. So here I'm using some odorless solvent and just seeing how that goes on the sanded paper. It definitely works a lot differently to watercolor paper because it doesn't absorb into the paper. It just sort of goes on top. So it picks up the pigment and it stays in the brush a bit. And when you initially put the brush down, it doesn't do much. But then once it starts picking up the pigment, it sort of smooths it all out. And it looks more painted than it does usually on watercolor paper. Quite an interesting effect. It also made the texture of the paper a little bit different for working on afterwards. So it's an interesting effect. It's quite different to what I was expecting. but it definitely is something that you can use in combination with the powder blender. However, I didn't do it myself, but I have heard that if you do the powder blender and then try to blend with odorless solvent without a layer of fixative in between, it can get all cluggy and gunky. So make sure to do a layer of fixative in between. I didn't test that out myself, but Lisa Lacree says that's what she discovered. So I'll take her word for it because she knows what she's talking about. Now I quite like the way the odorless solvent blended the color in. They made it so smooth. It does take a bit to get used to, though, how it works on the sanded paper. And just keep sharpening those edges as well. One thing I find challenging with the sanded paper is getting the details. It's not quite as easy to get detail in without getting a grainy look. But that might just be I need to practice a bit more. Figure out what I'm doing that's not getting the details in quite as easily as what I'm used to. And there you see I've changed the colour of the stem as well, made it more of a cobalt green rather than the yellowy green that I was doing before. Oh, and with the odorless solvent, do let it dry before going over with another layer of pencil. It's drying a bit differently too because on watercolor paper it absorbs into the paper, whereas this paper it doesn't at all. So it dries a little bit different as well. Now onto this flower. And as you can see, for a flower that I added in right halfway through the picture, it is looking pretty similar to the other one, especially once I've done all the defining of the petals and done all the extra layers. How opaque are those petals there that went on top of the background? I think that is probably the most impressive thing I find with the color pencil painting kit is this ability to just add in a flower, and one with white petals for that matter as well, because it wasn't there at all at the start. I had the background in there and I've just added it in, and it's so opaque and it doesn't look like it's on top of the background. You can't see the background through those petals. It opens up the opportunity to be a bit more, I guess, expressive with your artwork. With colored pencil, because you're so restricted, it's not a very forgiving medium. When you have to plan out the picture right from the start, you can't just change things, because if you make a mistake, you can't fix it very easily at all with colored pencil. And that is something that this changes, because I was able to just add in a flower, change a petal, remove a flower. You can actually alter these things, and that changes your approach to the picture altogether, because you can just change things. You don't need to be stuck to that original idea that you had in your head, where you drew out your initial sketch and everything, all the elements were in place, and you have to stick to that. You don't have to anymore. You can change things if you get halfway through and think, oh, that looks really bad in that spot. I need to change it in some way. You actually can now. You don't have to start the whole drawing again, which is what I would have done in the past. Because you couldn't make those alterations, and if it was a fundamental issue, you did actually have to just start it again. Or if you made a mistake, and you messed up an area, you had to start it again. Whereas here, you should be able to just go over it, and then you can fix it all up. Be curious to know if the texture fixative works on watercolor paper, because that would be an interesting method to see if you could then add that on to watercolor paper and what effect that would have. I'll have to test that out at some time. I'm just sharpening up those edges of the petals using that was my luminance white then. And now onto this flower. And this was another one that I added in. But for those two flowers, you can't tell that one was added in halfway through. They look the same in opaqueness, in colour, slight variation in colour, but that's more just because I did one and then the other. But for the most part, they look the same. And yeah, I just can't get over that. For something that was added in halfway through, I can't believe that that's how well that worked. I am amazed. Yep. I can't say that too many times. I'm just messing around with that flower now and added in a few petals because it looked like it needed more, but then I think I'd take them out again as well and change them a bit. And pretty much I'm just doing the same as I did with the other flowers, just adding in the colours and then blending it with odorless solvent and then going over and defining those petals a bit more and lightening them up. Not adding shadows in that part. I think with the odorless solvent, it makes everything a lot darker. The lighter colours sort of got washed out a bit. So that's something to bear in mind. On watercolor paper, the colours tend to, in general, stay the same. Some of them get a bit more vibrant, other ones go a bit dull, but in general, they stay the same. However, I found it definitely darkened them up a lot. It was like the darker pigments sort of overpowered the lighter pigments when you blended them over. I might have needed to use a smaller brush and be a bit more careful with how I was blending, because I was blending it like I usually do on watercolor paper. I just go over the whole area. But I think you need to be more mindful of where the light colors are and the dark colors are. even more so than on watercolor paper when blending with odorless solvent. Not that it's an issue because you can just go over with the light color again and then just go over the top of it. And also with the odorless solvent is you after you blend with odorless solvent, you can do the layer of fixative, put the color pencil over the top of that, and blend with odorless solvent again. And that is isolated from those layers before. So you can build up the multiple layers in quite an interesting way. Say with the color I'm doing now, if I blend that out with odorless solvent, that won't impact the layers that were done beforehand, so they won't darken up because they won't have that darker pigment going over the top of it. And that's just with my Polychromos white there as well. When it's got the silver extender on it, it's usually a Luminance pencil. When it's got the black extender on it, that's the Polychromos. I'm just adding a little touch of yellow just to make those petals look like they glow a little bit. And then I was just like, oh, let's remove those extra petals that I added. They didn't look so good after all. The only issue with doing that is then you've got to make that area sort of match the background behind it. Didn't really matter too much in this spot because it's a small area between the petals, but yeah, that would be something to be mindful of, is your ability to match it to the background. And here I decided, oh no, I didn't like that extra flower I added, and I'll just remove it and cover it all up. Doesn't take much effort to make it so that you can't even tell there was a flower there. And so there I sprayed with fixative, and now I'm coming back on top of it with more colour. In some areas I do find that it does get a little bit hard to cover up, just because sometimes it feels like there's dots that sort of some of the texture on the page holds onto pigment, and it doesn't want anything else to go on top of that, and it makes it a little bit hard to cover up. So occasionally that happens. I'm not sure if that's due to my paper being a bit dodgy or if it's with what I did. I'm getting it a little bit there in that corner. If you see the petal, where the petal was below that stem, in that spot there, it's not wanting to take a look the color, so you can sort of see the outline of the petals still, and so that just takes a bit of effort to hide it. So that's something to bear in mind, that can happen. It's not the end of the world, but it does make it a little bit harder to hide that spot. It didn't really want to take any more color on top of it. Here I was just like, oh, how about I add in some water drops too, because water drops are so easy to add in with colored pencil. But yeah, definitely would not have been able to just add in water drops or, a spider web. But just adding in these, I wasn't too careful with how it went. At this point, I was like, oh, I really want to start on a new piece and see what I can do for a proper piece. So I was just adding in some drops and seeing how realistic I could get them to look. And as you can see, the white came up really well on the paper. Easy to add in the little smudge of colour on the drop itself. Went a little bit overboard with my drops on the spider web. And just add in an extra one. Now the powder blender makes it so easy to make that smooth. It's fantastic. I love it. And just keep adding in those little drops wherever I wanted them. So now I'm using the titanium white with the touch-up texture mixed together, and just painting on with a liner brush. Just adding in little highlights all over the place on all the petals and the drops. And dabbing it if I've put a bit too much. And look at how well it does the highlights on those drops. I may go a little bit crazy with how much of this I put on the spider web. But oh well, I was just having a bit of fun. I put lots of little dots all over the place. Probably didn't need to do quite so many dots. But look how well that stands out though. I'm just adding in a few more stars while I've got the titanium white touch-up texture mixture out. And this stuff dries quite quickly, so don't make up too much at once. Once it dries, you can't really use it again. I found it sort of goes a bit crusty and it doesn't mix up with more touch-up texture. So yeah, don't make too much up at once, because yeah, it's not really reusable. Well, I can definitely say that I am pretty impressed with the um, colored pencil painting kit. I absolutely love it so far. I'm pretty keen to see what other projects I can make with it. So definitely got a thumbs up from me. I hope you guys have enjoyed this review of it and have found it useful. I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.